Tonight's lecture is about the Progressive Era. Here are the terms that you need to know. If you want to take a minute, you can pause here and write them down in advance, and I'll also put them up at the end of the lecture so you can double check and make sure you have all the terms that you need to know. The Progressive Era, which began in 1890 and ended in 1920, was an era of reform. As a result of the problems associated with industrialization, like poor working and living conditions, corruption in the government, the gap between the rich and the poor, as well as pressing social issues like women's rights and civil rights for African Americans, many Americans felt that the time had come for the government to be more responsible in taking an active role to improve the lives of its citizens. Progressives were the individuals and groups who actively campaigned to change America for the better, and this is when an era of progress was born. Progressives fought for a variety of reforms. Some focused on improving working conditions and ending child labor. Some pushed for women's suffrage, which means the right to vote, while others fought for food sanitation reform. We also saw reform movements to end segregation, improve living conditions, ban alcohol, end corruption in the government, lessen the gap between the rich and the poor, conserve natural resources, and end unfair business practices like monopolies and trusts. Even though all progressives didn't focus on the same issues, they all shared four common goals. The first one is that the government should be more accountable to its citizens. Instead of helping businesses and the wealthy, they should focus on the average American. The government should also limit the power of the wealthy. They should be more active in improving the lives of its citizens and should run more efficiently and be less corrupt. So progressives wanted laws passed to deal with the reform efforts that they found to be the most serious, and they wanted an end to the laissez-faire attitude that was pervasive during the industrial era. Many reformers became known as muckrakers. In a literal sense, a muckraker rakes up manure. The term was used as a metaphor to describe those people who investigated the problems in American society. By raking up the muck, they exposed the problems for all of America to see and hopefully reform. So for the most part, the muckrakers are investigative journalists. Upton St. Clair's The Jungle, published in 1906, is one of the era's most famous muckraking novels. St. Clair worked undercover in Chicago's meatpacking industry in order to expose the plight of the immigrant working poor. When Americans read his novel, however, the horrific conditions of Chicago's meatpacking industry is what caught everyone's attention instead, especially when they found out what was going in the meat: rats, spoiled meat, and even human remains. This led to a push for more sanitary working conditions in the meatpacking industry and the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act that same year, as well as the creation of the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA. A major campaign of the Progressive Era was the need to reform women's rights. Suffragists, or women who fought for the right to vote, had been working since the founding of our nation to secure voting rights for women. Their biggest obstacle was the idea of separate spheres, or separate worlds. This was the notion that a woman's place is in the home and a man's place is in the world of business and politics. As America entered the 20th century, women were undergoing changes that helped promote the notion that women should have more equal rights, especially the right to vote. Women were also very active in progressive reform campaigns, so that started to break down the barrier and the notion that women do not belong in the public world, since they were getting involved in politics and these reform movements. More women began to work outside of the home. By 1920, 25% of women were working outside of the home compared to just under 20% in 1880. More women were also working in professional jobs because more women were attending colleges. Today, women outnumber men when it comes to college enrollment, approximately 60% to 40%. In addition, women began holding off on marriage and children. The need and desire to not be dependent on a man for survival naturally led to a revived push for women's rights in the early 1900s. Despite these progressive changes for women, many Americans, including some women themselves, didn't see the need for women to vote. In 1913, anti-suffragists, so those who were against giving women the right to vote, published an advertisement called An Appeal to Men. So this was written by women. They stated that it's one of women's greatest rights to be free from politics, and they wanted men to protect them from having the right to vote, and asked men to please vote against an amendment that would actually give them this right. So obviously, when women themselves are saying they don't want the right to vote, it makes it hard for those that do to convince people otherwise. Political cartoons such as this one entitled Election Day were used to convince men that if women were allowed to vote, they'd abandon their role as wife and mother and gender roles would be reversed as women would become too masculine. So you can see the husband is here, he's stuck home with the kids, while the woman is going out to vote. Another argument against women's suffrage included the false notion that women are too easily manipulated and therefore can't be trusted to make up their own minds when voting. There was even a, quote, scientific study that claimed that if you tried to educate a woman and allow her to participate in politics, she would literally go crazy because her brain couldn't handle it. I know, very rude. Two main organizations who fought for women's suffrage were the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA, and the Congressional Union that later became the National Women's Party. The NAWSA was led by Carrie Chapman Catt. This organization believed that the right to vote could only be won slowly. Instead of trying to get a federal amendment passed, they aimed to convince each state to give women the right to vote. As they campaigned across the country, they used passive methods such as civil disobedience to get their point across. So for example, they would approach voter registration booths and demand that they be allowed to register. The Congressional Union was a much more aggressive, even militant group that attracted younger women to the cause for women's voting rights. The Congressional Union pushed for a federal amendment to the Constitution. So the NAWSA wants each individual state to pass an amendment to their Constitution. They thought that would be easier, but the Congressional Union wants a federal amendment to the Constitution. They feel they deserve that. They were the first women to ever picket outside of the White House, as you can see here, and they were arrested for blocking traffic, thrown in jail. They went on a hunger strike where Alice Paul was force-fed. They also burned a life-size dummy of President Wilson, all to get attention for their cause. The NAWSA saw the Congressional Union as a troublemaking group that was drawing negative attention to the campaign for women's suffrage. The two groups didn't get along well with each other. During World War I, women's contributions to the war effort temporarily broke down the barriers of separate spheres and casted a new light on the suffrage campaign. President Wilson was also very embarrassed by the treatment of the suffragists in jail, especially the force-feeding of Alice Paul. So in an effort to repair his reputation, he started to support women's suffrage. In 1920, suffragists had finally achieved voting rights with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Okay, so make sure you have these terms in your notebook, and don't forget to upload your summary to Schoology and answer the think questions either on TED or along with your summary. If you have any questions, please write them down and share them in class. Have a good night.